The dust kicked up by the wagon wheels hung in the hot Arizona air like a brown cloud. It was September 1885, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the small group traveling toward the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Inside the cramped wagon, 16-year-old Ayanna sat perfectly still, her dark eyes staring straight ahead. Her hands were bound with rough rope, but her spirit burned as fierce as ever. Just 2 weeks ago, she had been running free across the mesas with her younger brother, collecting wild berries and listening to their grandmother's stories about the old days. Now everything she had ever known was gone. The soldiers had come at dawn, just like in the stories the elders whispered around the fire. They took the children first. They always took the children first. The wagon jolted over another rock, and Ayanna's shoulder bumped against the wooden side. She didn't flinch. She had learned long ago not to show pain or fear in front of these people. The man driving the wagon, Agent Peterson, kept glancing back at her nervously. He had heard the stories about this one. 3 other families had already tried to place her, and each time she had caused nothing but trouble. When the tall brick buildings of the school finally came into view, Ayanna felt her stomach tighten. The place looked like a prison with its high walls and small windows. Children moved around the courtyard in straight lines, all wearing identical gray uniforms. Their hair was cut short, and they walked with their eyes down. She could see some of her own people among them, but they looked different now. Empty, broken, the wagon stopped with a lurch, and Agent Peterson climbed down. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and called out to a stern-looking woman who appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Williams, I've brought the Apache girl I told you about." "The one from the reservation?" Mrs. Williams walked down the steps slowly, her shoes clicking on the stone. She was a thin woman with gray hair pulled back so tight it made her face look sharp. Her pale blue eyes studied Ayanna like she was examining a wild animal. "So this is the one who's been causing all the problems. Well, we'll see about that." 2 older boys were called over to help Ayanna down from the wagon. She could have jumped down herself easily, but the ropes around her hands made it difficult. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she looked around, taking in every detail. The high fence, the guard at the gate, the distance to the nearest trees. Always planning, always looking for a way out. "Take her to the preparation room, Mrs. Williams instructed the boys. They grabbed Ayanna by the arms, but she shook them off and walked on her own. She would not be dragged like a dog. The preparation room was small and white, with a wooden chair in the center and shelves lined with scissors, combs, and bottles of strange-smelling liquids. Another woman waited inside, holding a pair of large scissors that gleamed in the lamplight. "Sit," Mrs. Williams commanded, pointing to the chair. Ayanna remained standing. She understood English perfectly well, had been learning it secretly from a trader who sometimes visited their camp, but she refused to show these people she could understand them. Let them think she was ignorant. It was better that way. I said, "Sit." Mrs. Williams' voice grew sharper. Still, Ayanna stood motionless. The woman with the scissors looked nervous. "Maybe we should wait until she calms down," she suggested quietly. "Nonsense. The sooner we begin the civilizing process, the better." Mrs. Williams nodded to the 2 boys, who stepped forward again. This time, they forced Ayanna into the chair and held her shoulders down. The first cut felt like a piece of her soul being torn away. Ayanna's long black hair had never been cut, not once in her 16 years. In her culture, hair carried power, memory, connection to the ancestors. As thick locks fell to the floor around her feet, she felt each one like a physical wound. But she did not cry out. She would not give them that satisfaction. When they were finished, Ayanna's head felt strangely light. She caught sight of herself in a small mirror on the wall and barely recognized the person staring back. Her hair now hung just below her ears, choppy and uneven. She looked like a stranger. Next came the clothes. They burned her traditional dress, her moccasins, even the small leather pouch that held her grandmother's turquoise stone. She watched the flames consume everything that connected her to home, to family, to who she really was. In place of her own clothes, they gave her a rough gray dress, black shoes that pinched her feet, and stockings that itched against her skin. "Your name is no longer Ayanna," Mrs. Williams announced, writing something in a large book. "From now on you will be called Ruth Patterson. That is a proper Christian name for a proper Christian girl." Ruth. The name felt foreign on her tongue, like trying to speak with a mouthful of stones. She would never answer to it, she decided. They could call her whatever they wanted, but inside she would always be Ayanna. The dormitory was a long, narrow room filled with iron beds lined up in perfect rows. Each girl was assigned a number, and Ayanna was given number 47. She was shown to a bed near the back corner, beside a window that looked out onto the courtyard. At least she could see the sky from here, that first night as she lay on the thin mattress listening to the quiet sobs of homesick children. Ayanna made herself a promise. She would not let this place break her. She would not become one of those empty-eyed children she had seen in the courtyard. Somehow, some way, she would find her way back home. The next morning began at 5 o'clock with the ringing of a loud bell. The girls dressed quickly and silently, then lined up for inspection. Ayanna watched the routine and followed along, but inside she was already planning. She studied the guard schedules, memorized the layout of the buildings, and noted which windows were left unlocked. In the classroom, they tried to teach her to read English letters and numbers. She pretended not to understand, even though she could already read simple words. During manual training, where the girls learned to sew and cook proper meals, Ayanna moved slowly and clumsily on purpose, ruining everything she touched. At prayer time, she stood silent while the others recited words to a God she did not know. The other children began to whisper about her. Some were afraid, thinking she might bring punishment down on all of them. Others looked at her with a mixture of admiration and envy, wishing they still had the courage to resist. A few tried to befriend her, but Ayanna kept to herself. Trust was dangerous in a place like this. 3 weeks after her arrival, Ayanna made her first escape attempt. She waited until the middle of the night, when the guards were changing shifts, and slipped out through a window in the laundry room. She made it almost 10 miles before they caught her, following the railroad tracks toward home. They brought her back in chains and locked her in a small, dark room with nothing but bread and water for a week, but they couldn't lock up her spirit. The moment they let her out, she began planning her next escape, and the next. Each time she got a little further, learned a little more about the land around the school, and grew more determined to find her way back to her people. After her third escape attempt, Mrs. Williams finally admitted defeat. "This one is too wild," she told Agent Peterson. "We've tried everything, but she simply refuses to be civilized. Perhaps a family placement would work better. Someone who can watch her constantly and break her will through hard work." And so began the search for someone foolish enough to take on the Apache girl who refused to be tamed. Samuel Morrison woke up to silence, just like he had every morning for the past 5 years. The big house felt hollow around him, filled with memories that seemed to echo in every room. He pulled on his worn boots and walked to the kitchen, where he made coffee for one and ate breakfast alone at a table built for 6. Outside, the Arizona morning was crisp and clear. His ranch stretched out as far as the eye could see, rolling hills covered in grass that turned golden in the early light. It was beautiful land, the kind of place most men would be proud to call home. But beauty meant nothing when you had nobody to share it with. Samuel had inherited the ranch from his father, who had carved it out of nothing with his bare hands back in 1865, for 20 years. Samuel had worked alongside the old man, learning every inch of the property, every water source, every seasonal pattern of the cattle. When his father died, Samuel had big dreams of expanding the herd, building up the ranch, maybe even starting a family of his own. Those dreams had seemed within reach when he met Elizabeth in town 5 years ago. She was the daughter of the bank. President, educated and refined, with soft hands and a gentle laugh that made his heart skip. Their courtship was proper and sweet, and when they married in the spring of 1880, Samuel felt like the luckiest man alive. Elizabeth had tried to make the ranch house into a home. She planted flowers around the porch, hung curtains in the windows, and filled the rooms with the sound of her singing while she worked. For 2 wonderful years, the house had felt alive. Samuel would come in from working cattle to find fresh bread cooling on the counter and Elizabeth waiting with stories about her day. Then she got pregnant and everything changed. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Elizabeth was often sick, too weak to do much of anything. Samuel hired a woman from town to help with the housework and spent every spare moment trying to make his wife comfortable. But as the months went on, she only got worse. The baby came 2 months early on a cold February night in '82. Samuel rode hard through a snowstorm to fetch the doctor, but by the time they returned, it was too late. Elizabeth died just after dawn, and the tiny baby boy never drew a breath. In one terrible night, Samuel lost everything that mattered to him. The neighbors had tried to help at first. The women brought casseroles and offered to clean the house. The men invited him to town for drinks and tried to interest him in business deals or social events. But Samuel couldn't bear their sympathy or their well-meaning advice about moving on with his life. How could he move on when everything reminded him of what he had lost? Gradually, he stopped going to town except for supplies. He let the flowers Elizabeth had planted die and took down the curtains she had hung. The house became just a place to sleep and eat, nothing more. His only companions were his horses and cattle, and the hired hands who came and went with the seasons. Most of the local ranchers thought Samuel had lost his mind when he started taking in difficult horses. It began with a Mustang stallion that had been captured but couldn't be broken. The previous owner was ready to shoot the animal rather than waste any more time on it. Samuel bought the horse for next to nothing and spent months just sitting near the corral, not trying to ride or train, just being present. Something about those wild horses spoke to him. They had been free once, running across the open range without a care in the world. The humans had captured them, tried to force them into a life they never chose. Some horses accepted their fate and became good saddle mounts. Others, like the Mustang stallion, never stopped fighting for their freedom. Samuel understood that feeling. He felt trapped too, caught between a past he couldn't change and a future he couldn't imagine. Working with the difficult horses gave him a sense of purpose, something to focus on besides his own grief. He developed a reputation for being able to handle animals that nobody else could manage. Word spread slowly through the territory. Other ranchers began bringing their problem horses to Samuel's place. Some were former Mustangs that had never fully accepted domestication. Others were horses that had been mistreated and couldn't trust humans anymore. A few were just born wild, with spirits too big for most people to understand. Samuel never broke these horses the way other trainers did. He didn't use harsh bits or whips or force them into submission. Instead, he spent time with them, learning their individual personalities and fears. He discovered that most difficult horses weren't actually mean or stupid. They were just afraid or hurt or confused about what was expected of them. The work was slow and sometimes dangerous. Samuel collected his share of bruises and scars from horses that lashed out in fear or anger. But gradually, patiently, he found ways to communicate with them. He learned to read their body language, to understand when they were nervous or angry or starting to trust. Most importantly, he learned to respect their need for choice. Some horses never did become completely tame, and Samuel accepted that. He gave them good food and shelter and the freedom to be themselves. Others slowly learned to work with humans, but only on their own terms. These were often the best horses in the end, loyal and intelligent because they had chosen to cooperate rather than being forced into it. The success with difficult horses helped Samuel's reputation, but it didn't make him any less lonely. If anything, it made his isolation worse. People respected his skills, but they thought he was strange for spending so much time with animals instead of trying to rebuild his social life. Some whispered that losing his wife and child had affected his mind. Samuel didn't care what they said. The horses didn't judge him or offer unwanted advice about moving on. They didn't expect him to smile and pretend everything was fine. They accepted him as he was, damaged and grieving, but still capable of kindness. The big house remained empty except for Samuel. He ate his meals alone and spent his evenings reading by lamplight or working on ranch records. Sometimes on particularly quiet nights he could almost hear Elizabeth's laughter echoing through the rooms, or imagine he caught a glimpse of her moving through the kitchen. Those moments were both precious and painful. By 1885, Samuel had settled into a solitary routine that seemed likely to last the rest of his life. He was only 42, but he felt much older. His hair was already showing gray at the temples, and lines were etched deep around his eyes from squinting into the sun and the weight of constant sadness. Then, on a hot September morning, Agent Peterson rode up to the ranch house with an unusual request. The Indian school was looking for a placement for a difficult Apache girl who had proven impossible to manage. They needed someone who could provide strict supervision and hard work to break her rebellious spirit. Most people would have said no immediately. Taking in a young Indian woman would cause talk, and Samuel had enough problems without adding to them. But as Peterson described the girl's repeated escape attempts and stubborn refusal to conform, something stirred in Samuel's chest. She sounded exactly like the wild horses he had been working with, spirited and unbroken despite everything they had tried to do to her. Maybe it was loneliness, or maybe it was recognition of a kindred spirit. Whatever the reason, Samuel found himself saying yes to Peterson's request, agreeing to take responsibility for the Apache girl who refused to be tamed. The iron shackles around Ayana's wrists had rubbed her skin raw during the long wagon ride to the ranch. She sat perfectly straight in the back of the government wagon, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the landscape around her. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains, and she could see cattle scattered across the grassland like brown dots. This place felt different from the school, more open, but she wasn't fooled. It was still a prison, just one with wider walls. Agent Peterson kept glancing back at her nervously, mopping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. Beside him sat Agent Collins, a younger man who kept his hand resting on his pistol. Both men had heard the stories about this Apache girl. 3 escape attempts from the school, 2 broken windows, and one incident where she had bitten a teacher who tried to force her to speak English. They weren't taking any chances. "You sure this rancher knows what he's getting into?" Collins asked quietly, but his voice carried in the still air. "Morrison requested all the details," Peterson replied. "Said he's handled difficult cases before, though I gotta say he's never dealt with anything like this one." Ayana understood every word but kept her expression blank. Let them think she was just a dumb savage who couldn't follow their conversation. It was better when people underestimated her. She had learned that lesson well at the school. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small hill. It was bigger than Ayana had expected, a 2-story wooden structure with a wide porch and several outbuildings scattered around it. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and she could see a man walking toward the corral where several horses moved restlessly. In the morning light, the wagon wheels crunched on the gravel as they pulled up to the front of the house. The man by the corral straightened and walked toward them, moving with the easy stride of someone comfortable in his own space. This had to be the rancher, Samuel Morrison. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and gray threading through his brown hair. But it was his eyes that caught Ayana's attention. They were sad eyes, the kind that came from deep loss, but there was something else there too. Kindness, maybe, or at least the memory of it. "Mr. Morrison," Agent Peterson called out as he climbed down from the wagon. "We've brought the girl. As arranged, now I want to remind you of the conditions. She's to be watched at all times. Any signs of rebellion or escape attempts, you contact us immediately. The government is paying you well for this service, but we expect results." Samuel nodded, but his attention was focused on Ayana. She met his gaze steadily, neither defiant nor submissive, just watching. Most white men looked at her like she was either a dangerous animal or a piece of property. This one looked at her like she was a person, which was unsettling in its own way. "Help her down," Peterson instructed the agents. "I can manage," Samuel said quietly, stepping forward. He offered his hand to Ayana, not grabbing or demanding, just offering. She ignored the gesture and climbed down from the wagon herself, the chains making the movement awkward but not impossible. Peterson pulled out a thick folder of papers. These are her records from the school. 3 escape attempts, constant refusal to speak English, destruction of property, assault on staff. She's been given the Christian name Ruth Patterson, though she refuses to answer to it. The school recommends firm discipline and constant supervision. Samuel took the folder but didn't open it. Instead, he kept watching Ayana, who was studying the ranch buildings and the surrounding landscape. He could almost see her mind working, cataloging details, looking for weaknesses and opportunities. "The shackles," Samuel said simply. "What about them?" Peterson asked. "Take them off." Collins stepped forward. "Sir, I don't think that's wise. This one is dangerous. She's already tried to escape 3 times. If she runs, I'll find her," Samuel said calmly, "but I won't keep a person in chains on my land." The agents exchanged worried glances, but they had their orders. Morrison was taking responsibility for the girl now. Peterson unlocked the shackles with obvious reluctance, and Ayana rubbed her raw wrist without showing any emotion. The moment of freedom was brief, but she felt it like a cool breeze after a long hot day. "Remember, any problems at all, you contact us," Peterson warned as the agents climbed back into their wagon. "The Indian Agency doesn't tolerate failure in these placements." Samuel watched the wagon disappear down the dusty road before turning back to Ayana. She stood exactly where they had left her, not moving toward the house or away from it, just waiting to see what would happen next. "You hungry?" he asked. No response. Ayana's dark eyes remained fixed on his face, but she might as well have been carved from stone. "Well, I am," Samuel said, starting toward the house. "Kitchen's this way if you change your mind." Ayana didn't follow, but she didn't run either. She stood in the yard for a long time, watching Samuel move around inside the house, studying the layout of the buildings and listening to the sounds of the ranch. Horses nickered in the corral, cattle lowed in the distance, and somewhere a dog barked. It was peaceful in a way the school had never been, but peace could be deceptive, eventually. Hunger and curiosity drove her toward the house. The front door stood open, and she could see Samuel moving around in what looked like a kitchen. She stepped onto the porch carefully, testing each board for squeaks, then moved silently to peer through the doorway. Samuel was making some kind of stew, stirring a pot over the wood stove. He glanced up and saw her in the doorway, but didn't say anything, just continued cooking. After a moment, he ladled the stew into 2 bowls and set them on a small wooden table. Then he sat down and began eating, leaving the second bowl untouched. Ayana remained in the doorway, torn between hunger and caution. The stew smelled good, better than anything she had eaten at the school, but accepting food felt like accepting captivity. Still, she needed to keep her strength up if she was going to escape from this place. Moving like a wild animal approaching a water hole, she edged into the kitchen and sat at the far end of the table. The stew was thick with meat and vegetables, seasoned with herbs she didn't recognize. She ate quickly, ready to bolt if necessary, but Samuel just continued with his own meal as if having a silent Apache girl at his table was the most natural thing in the world. When she finished eating, Ayana pushed the bowl away and stood up. Samuel looked up from his food. "There's a room upstairs, first door on the right. Clean sheets on the bed and water for washing. You can rest if you want." Still, no response from Ayana, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe. At the school, rest was something you earned through good behavior, not something freely offered. She climbed the stairs cautiously, testing each step. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the ranch yard. More importantly, the window wasn't barred like the ones at the school. The lock was simple, the kind she could easily open if she needed to. That first night, Ayana didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the shadows move across the yard, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Samuel moved around downstairs for a while, then the house grew quiet. No guards patrolled the yard, no bells rang every hour to mark the time. The silence was almost unnerving after months of institutional noise. In the days that followed, a strange routine developed. Samuel would leave food for her in the kitchen, work around the ranch during the day, and speak to her occasionally. In his quiet voice, He never demanded responses, never tried to force her to work or pray or speak English. He just went about his business as if she were a guest rather than a prisoner. Ayanna tested the boundaries carefully. She explored the house when Samuel was outside, learning its layout and exits. She walked around the ranch yard, noting the distances to the road and the mountains beyond. She watched Samuel work with his horses, curious despite herself about his gentle methods, but she never spoke, never acknowledged his presence directly, and never let her guard down. This could all be a trick, a new way of trying to break her. Spirit through kindness instead of force. She had learned not to trust anyone in authority, and Samuel Morrison was just another white man trying to change her into something she wasn't. Still, there was something different about this place, something that made her feel almost human again after months of being treated like a problem to be solved. The food was good, the room was comfortable, and nobody hit her or screamed at her or tried to force her to do things that went against everything she believed. For the first time since leaving her family, Ayanna began to think that maybe she might be able to survive this place long enough to find her way home. 3 weeks had passed since Ayanna arrived at the ranch, and Samuel was beginning to understand what the agents meant when they called her difficult. Not because she caused trouble, but because she was like trying to understand smoke. She moved through the house and around the ranch like a ghost, there but not there, present but completely unreachable, every morning. Samuel would find his kitchen exactly as he had left it, except for one clean bowl in the sink. The food he left out for her always disappeared, but he never saw her eat. Sometimes he caught glimpses of her moving past windows or standing in the shadows of the barn, but if he looked directly, she would vanish like morning mist. She never spoke, never acknowledged his presence, and never seemed to sleep. Samuel had gotten up several times during the night to check on unusual sounds, only to see her silhouette sitting by her bedroom window, staring out at the darkness like she was waiting for something. The whole situation reminded him of his work with wild horses, but Ayanna was more challenging than any Mustang he had ever encountered. At least horses showed their emotions clearly. When they were angry, they pinned their ears back and showed their teeth. When they were afraid, they rolled their eyes and danced away from whatever scared them. Ayanna showed nothing at all. On this particular morning, Samuel was repairing a section of fence near the main corral when he noticed her standing by the gate. She had been there for over an hour, perfectly still, watching something inside the enclosure. Samuel followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention. The young Mustang Murray stood in the far corner of the corral, as far from the gate as she could get. Samuel had captured her just 2 weeks before Ayanna's arrival, and she was proving to be one of the most difficult horses he had ever worked with. Not aggressive, just completely terrified of human contact. Every time he entered the corral, she would press herself against the fence and shake with fear. The Mare was beautiful, with a dark bay coat and a white star on her forehead. She couldn't be more than 3 years old, probably had never been. Touched by human hands before Samuel's men roped her during a roundup of wild horses that had been eating his cattle's grass. Most of the other Mustangs had adapted to captivity within a few days, but this one seemed determined to die rather than accept her new situation. Samuel had tried everything he could think of. He had sat in the corral for hours, not moving, just letting her get used to his presence. He had brought her the best hay and grain, leaving it near her corner of the fence. He had spoken to her in the calm, quiet voice that usually worked with frightened animals. Nothing had made any difference. If anything, she seemed to be getting more withdrawn each day. Now, watching Ayanna watch the horse, Samuel had an idea that was either brilliant or completely crazy. Maybe the Mare needed someone who understood what it felt like to be captured, caged, and forced into a life you never chose. Samuel set down his tools and walked slowly toward the corral. Ayanna's eyes flicked to him briefly but returned to the Mare. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to give her space to move away if she wanted. "She's been here 2 weeks," he said, not looking at Ayanna but focusing on the horse. "Hasn't let me get within 10 feet of her, won't eat if I'm anywhere around. Just stands in that corner shaking. No response from Ayana, but Samuel hadn't expected one. He continued talking, more to himself than to her. I've worked with a lot of scared horses, but this one's different. It's like she's given up hope of ever being free again. Just waiting to die, I think. The Marais shifted nervously, pressing harder against the fence as if she could push through it by sheer willpower. Her ribs were starting to show despite the good feed Samuel provided. She was literally wasting away from fear and despair. Reminds me of something I read once, Samuel continued, still speaking quietly. About how some wild birds, if you cage them, they'll beat themselves to death against the bars rather than live in captivity. This Mari's doing the same thing, just slower. Ayana's hands tightened slightly on the fence rail, the first real emotion Samuel had seen her show since her arrival. He pressed on, sensing he might be getting through to her somehow. Problem is, I can't just let her go. She doesn't know how to survive around here anymore. Been feeding her for 2 weeks and there's been no rain. All the good grass is on private. Land now, turn her loose and she's starve, or get shot by some rancher who doesn't want wild horses eating his cattle's feed. Samuel pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the gate to the corral. Seems to me she needs someone who understands what it's like to be trapped between two worlds. Someone who knows what it feels like when all your choices are taken away. He pushed the gate open and stepped back. She needs someone who understands what freedom really means. For a long moment, nothing happened. Ayana stood frozen by the fence, staring at the open gate. The Marais remained pressed against the far corner, trembling with fear. Samuel waited, hardly breathing, wondering if he had just made a terrible mistake. Then Ayana moved. Slowly, carefully, she stepped through the gate into the corral. The Marais' head shot up, and she snorted with alarm. But something about Ayana's movement was different from anything the horse had experienced before. There was no aggression, no attempt to dominate or control. Ayana moved like water. Rather than forcing Samuel backed away from the corral, giving them space but staying close enough to intervene if something went wrong. He needn't have worried. Ayana stopped just inside the gate and stood perfectly still, not looking directly at the Marais, but not ignoring her either. She simply existed in the space, calm and patient. Minutes passed. The Marais, trembling gradually, subsided, though she remained pressed against the fence. Ayana made no move to approach her, just stood there breathing quietly. Samuel found himself holding his own breath, watching something he had never seen before. Very slowly, Ayana began to hum. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from deep in her chest. It wasn't any tune Samuel recognized, probably something from her Apache heritage, but it had an almost hypnotic quality. The Marais' ears pricked forward for the first time since Samuel had captured her. Her head turned slightly toward Ayana, curiosity beginning to overcome fear. The humming continued, soft and steady, a sound that spoke of understanding and shared pain. Time seemed to slow down. Samuel lost track of how long they stood there. The young Apache woman and the wild horse, both prisoners in their own ways, both trying to survive in a world that had stolen their freedom. The sun moved across the sky, shadows shifted in the corral, but neither Ayana nor the Marais moved from their positions. Then, just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, something magical happened. The Marais took a step away from the fence. Just one step, but it was toward Ayana rather than away from her. Ayana's humming never changed, never faltered, but Samuel saw her shoulders relax slightly. Another step, then another. The Marais was moving slowly, cautiously, but she was definitely approaching the young woman who stood so still in the center of the corral. When she was about 6 feet away, the Marais stopped and stretched her neck out, nostrils flaring as she tried to catch Ayana's scent. Ayana finally looked directly at the horse. And for the first time since her arrival at the ranch, Samuel saw something other than emptiness in her dark eyes. There was recognition there, understanding, and something that might have been compassion. The Marais took one more step, close enough now that Ayana could have reached out and touched her. But she didn't. She just stood there, letting the horse make all the choices. offering her presence without demanding anything in return. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Samuel quietly closed the gate and walked back to the house. Whatever was happening in that corral was between Ayana and the Mare. He had given them the gift of choice, and now he would wait to see what they chose to do with it that night. For the first time since her arrival, Ayana did not sit by her window. Instead, Samuel saw her walking slowly around the corral in the moonlight, the Mare following at a distance, both of them finding something they had lost in each other's company. The days following that first connection between Ayana and the Mare brought changes that Samuel had never expected. Every morning when he went out to check on the horses, he would find Ayana already at the corral, standing near the fence or sometimes sitting on the ground just outside the gate. The Mare, who he had started thinking of as a lost cause, now moved freely around the enclosure instead of pressing herself against the far corner. It was slow progress, measured in inches, rather than miles, but it was real progress. Samuel watched from a distance as Ayana gradually moved closer to the Mare each day. First, she would sit just inside the gate, then a few steps closer, then closer still until she was sitting in the middle of the corral while the Mare grazed peacefully nearby. The most amazing thing was how natural it all looked. Samuel had spent 20 years learning to read horses, understanding their body language and moods, but watching Ayana with the Mare was like seeing someone speak a language he had never heard before. She seemed to know exactly when to move and when to stay still, when to look at the horse and when to look away. On the 5th day, Samuel heard something that made him stop what he was doing and listen carefully. It was Ayana's voice, but not the humming she had done that first afternoon. She was talking to the Mare, speaking in a language Samuel didn't recognize but knew must be Apache. Her voice was soft and musical, with rising and falling tones that sounded almost like a song. The Mare's ears were pricked forward, listening intently as if she understood every word. Maybe she did, in her own way. Animals were good at reading emotions and intentions even if they couldn't understand the actual words. Whatever Ayana was saying, it was working better than anything Samuel had ever tried. By the end of the first week, the Mare was eating grain from a bucket while Ayana sat just a few feet away. By the end of the second week, she was allowing Ayana to approach within arm's reach. Though she would still tense up if the young woman moved too quickly, Samuel found himself spending more and more time watching this gradual friendship develop. He had work to do around the ranch, cattle to check on and fences to repair, but something about what was happening in that corral held him captivated. It was like watching a miracle unfold one small step at a time. The breakthrough came on a crisp morning in early October. Samuel was mending harness in the barn when he heard Ayana's voice change. Instead of the soft, conversational tone she had been using, her words became more rhythmic, almost like a chant. Curious, he walked to the barn door and looked toward the corral. Ayana was standing in the center of the enclosure, her arms outstretched and her face turned toward the sky. She was speaking in Apache, but even without understanding the words, Samuel could feel the power in them. It sounded like a prayer, or maybe a song of greeting to the morning sun. The Mare stood perfectly still about 10 feet away, watching Ayana with an intensity Samuel had never seen in a horse before. Her ears were forward, her head was high, and every muscle in her body seemed focused on the young woman in the center of the corral. Slowly, Ayana lowered her arms and turned to face the Mare. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, woman and horse, both wild spirits who had been captured and caged but never truly broken. Then Ayana began to walk toward the Mare, not slowly and carefully as she had been doing for weeks, but with confidence and purpose. The Mare didn't move away. Instead, she took a step forward, then another, until they met in the middle of the corral. Ayana reached out her hand, palm up, and the Mare lowered her head to sniff it. Then, for the first time since her capture, the wild horse allowed a human being to touch her. Samuel watched in amazement as Ayana's hand moved gently along the Mare's neck, stroking the dark coat with the same careful attention he had seen her use when handling delicate things in the house. The Mare's eyes closed partially, and she made a soft, nickering sound that Samuel had never heard from her before. Over the next few days, the touching became more frequent and more extensive. Ayana would run her hands along the Mare's shoulders, down her legs, across her back. She was teaching the horse to accept human contact, but she was doing it in a way that respected the animal's dignity and fear. Samuel realized that Ayana was working entirely by instinct and feeling. She had probably never seen a horse trained before coming to the ranch, yet she seemed to understand exactly what the Mare needed. It was as if she could feel the horse's emotions and respond to them in just the right way. The most remarkable change was in Ayana herself. For the first time since her arrival, she seemed truly alive. The emptiness in her eyes was replaced by focus and purpose. She moved with more energy, and Samuel occasionally caught glimpses of what might have been contentment on her face when she thought no one was watching. One morning, Samuel saw Ayana enter the corral carrying a length of soft rope he had left near the gate. She showed it to the Mare, letting her sniff it and see that it wasn't dangerous. Then, moving with infinite patience, she began to loop it around the horse's neck like a simple halter. The Mare tensed at first, but Ayana's voice continued its gentle flow of Apache words, and gradually the horse relaxed. The rope wasn't tight or constraining, just a gentle presence that connected woman and horse in a new way. For several days, Ayana led the Mare around the corral using the rope halter. The horse followed willingly, stepping carefully and staying close to Ayana's shoulder. Samuel watched this progress with growing amazement. He had seen professional horse trainers take months to achieve what Ayana had accomplished in just a few weeks. Then came the day that changed everything. Samuel was working on the ranch's account books in his kitchen when he heard something that made him look up sharply. It was the sound of hoofbeats, but not the heavy, rhythmic pounding of a horse being ridden hard. These were lighter, more dancing steps. Like a horse moving for the pure joy of movement, he walked outside and looked toward the corral, expecting to see the Mare running in circles as she sometimes did when the weather was cool. Instead, he saw something that took his breath away. Ayana was on the Mare's back, sitting bareback with nothing but the rope halter for control. But this wasn't the kind of riding Samuel was used to seeing. There was no fighting, no pulling, no struggle for dominance. Horse and rider moved together like they were part of the same being. The Mare wasn't running, exactly. She was flowing across the ground in a smooth, rolling gait that looked almost like dancing. Ayana sat perfectly balanced, her long hair streaming behind her, her face transformed by an expression of pure joy that Samuel had never seen before. They moved around the corral in wide, graceful circles, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but always in perfect harmony. Samuel could see that Ayana wasn't controlling the Mare in any traditional sense. She was simply suggesting direction with slight shifts of her weight or gentle pressure from her legs, and the horse was responding because she wanted to, not because she was forced to. As he watched, Samuel realized he was witnessing something sacred. This wasn't just a girl learning to ride a horse. This was two spirits recognizing each other, two beings who had found in each other the freedom they had both lost. The Mare had found someone who understood her need to run, and Ayana had found a way to soar even while staying on the ground. When they finally stopped, both breathing hard but clearly exhilarated, Ayana slid down from the Mare's back and rested, her forehead against the horse's neck. Samuel could see her lips moving, probably speaking words of thanks or affection in her native language. For the first time since her arrival at the ranch, Ayana looked truly at peace, and for the first time in 5 years, Samuel felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. The change in Ayana was like watching a flower bloom after a long, harsh winter. Where once she had moved through the ranch like a silent shadow, now she walked with purpose and energy. The empty look in her dark eyes had been replaced by something Samuel hadn't seen since her arrival. Hope. It started with small things. Samuel began finding his breakfast dishes washed and put away when he came in from his morning chores. The kitchen floor would be swept clean, and fresh water would be waiting in the pitcher by the sink. When he thanked her, Ayana would just nod slightly, but he could see something softer in her expression. The Mare, who Samuel had started calling Windrunner after hearing Ayana use that name in Apache, had become completely devoted to the young woman. Every morning, the horse would be waiting by the gate of the corral, whinnying softly when she saw Ayana approaching. The two had developed routines that looked more like a dance than horse training. Samuel watched in amazement as Ayana worked, with Windrunner using methods he had never seen before. Instead of forcing the horse to accept a saddle and bit like most trainers would do, Ayana seemed content to ride bareback with just the simple rope halter. But her control over the horse was absolute, achieved through understanding rather than dominance. One afternoon, while repairing a water trough near the corral, Samuel heard something that made him stop and listen. Ayana was talking to Windrunner, but this time she wasn't using Apache. Her words were in English, spoken hesitantly but clearly. "Good girl, Windrunner," she said, stroking the mare's neck. "You run like the wind across the mesa, just like the horses in grandmother's stories." It was the first time Samuel had heard her speak English since her arrival 2 months ago. Her accent was thick and she searched for some words, but her meaning was clear. More importantly, she was choosing to use the language of her captors, which meant she was starting to see this place as something other than a prison. The breakthrough with language opened new doors. Samuel began talking to Ayana while she worked with Windrunner, explaining things about ranch life and horse care. At first, she would just listen without responding, but gradually she started asking questions. "Why this horse so afraid when you catch her?" she asked one day, her English careful but understandable. Samuel thought about how to explain it in simple terms. "Some horses are born wild and free. When humans capture them, it's like being stolen from your family and forced to live in a strange place where you don't understand the rules." Ayana was quiet for a long time after that, and Samuel realized she understood exactly what he meant. They were talking about more than just horses. As the weeks passed, Samuel discovered that Ayana had an almost supernatural gift for working with difficult animals. It wasn't just Windrunner who responded to her touch and voice. Other horses on the ranch, ones that had been skittish or hard to handle, began seeking her out when she walked through the pastures. Word of this gift spread quickly through the territory. Ranching was a tight community, and news traveled fast when someone could do something extraordinary. Within a month, Samuel had his first visitor looking for help with a problem horse. Jake Thompson rode up to the ranch, leading a beautiful paint stallion that was dancing and fighting against the lead rope. The horse was covered in sweat and had cuts on his legs from struggling against ropes and fences. "Morrison, I heard you got someone here who's good with difficult horses," Thompson called out. "This one's been nothing but trouble since I bought him. Can't get near him without him trying to kick or bite. I'm about ready to sell him for dog food." Samuel looked at the stallion and saw the same wild fear in his eyes that Windrunner had shown when she first arrived. The horse had probably been mistreated, or maybe he was just one of those animals who couldn't accept being owned by anyone. "What do you want me to do with him?" Samuel asked. "See if you can make him rideable. I paid good money for this horse, and he's got excellent bloodlines. Should be perfect for breeding, but first I need to be able to handle him safely." Samuel was about to explain that this kind of training took months, not days, when he saw Ayana walking toward them from the corral. The paint stallion's head shot up and his ears pricked forward. Something about her presence seemed to calm him slightly. "Maybe we can help," Samuel said, surprising himself. "But it'll take time, and we do things differently here. No whips, no harsh bits, no breaking his spirit. If you want a robot, you'll have to go somewhere else." Thompson looked skeptical but agreed to leave the stallion for 2 weeks. As soon as the rancher rode away, Ayana approached the paint horse with the same patience she had shown Windrunner. The stallion was more aggressive than the mare had been, striking out with his front hooves and snapping his teeth, but Ayana never flinched or backed down. Over the next few days, Samuel watched her work the same magic she had used on Windrunner. First, she just sat near the stallion's corral, speaking to him in Apache and occasionally in English. Gradually, the horse's aggression faded, replaced by curiosity about this small human who showed no fear but also no desire to dominate. By the end of the first week, Ayana was able to touch the stallion. By the end of the second week, she was riding him bareback around the corral, the same way she rode Windrunner. When Thompson returned to collect his horse, he couldn't believe what he saw. "That's impossible," he said. Watching Ayana guide the stallion through complex movements with nothing but weight shifts and gentle touches. 2 weeks ago, that horse tried to kill me. Now he's following her around like a pet dog. Word spread. Even faster after that. Within a month, Samuel had 3 more horses in his corrals, all brought by ranchers who had heard about the Apache girl who could gentle the wildest animals. Some of the horses had been abused and were afraid of human contact. Others were just naturally wild, like Windrunner, and had never accepted domestication. Ayana worked with each one differently, seeming to understand instinctively what each horse needed. With the abused animals, she moved slowly and spoke softly, rebuilding their trust in humans one gentle touch at a time. With the naturally wild ones, she challenged them to races and games, showing them that cooperation could be more fun than resistance. Samuel found himself learning as much as the horses did. Watching Ayana work taught him new ways of thinking about the relationship between humans and animals. She never tried to break their spirits or force them into submission. Instead, she offered them partnership, showing them that they could keep their wildness while still working with humans. The money from training problem horses was good, but that wasn't what made Samuel happiest about the arrangement. What made him smile was seeing Ayana come alive in ways he had never expected. She had found her purpose, something that gave her joy and made her feel valuable. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch and tell Samuel about the horses she was working with, describing their personalities and progress in the mixture of Apache and English that had become her natural way of speaking. She taught him Apache words for different types of weather and animal behavior, knowledge that proved surprisingly useful for ranch work. "In Apache, we have 12 different words for wind," she explained one evening as they watched Windrunner graze in the pasture. "Each one means something different about what the weather will do, what the animals will do, how the grass will grow." Samuel listened carefully, filing away this information that could help him better care for his land and livestock. But more than the practical knowledge, he treasured these conversations because they meant Ayana was starting to trust him with pieces of her real self. For the first time since her arrival, she was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to heal, and in helping wounded horses find their way back to wholeness, she was finding her own path to healing as well. The trouble started on a cold November morning when Samuel rode into town for supplies. He could feel eyes following him as he tied his horse to the hitching post outside Hendrick's general store. The usual friendly nods from neighbors were replaced by cold stares and whispered conversations that stopped the moment he got close enough to hear. Inside the store, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Mrs. Hendricks, who had always been pleasant and talkative, barely looked at him while she gathered his order. Other customers moved away when he approached, creating empty spaces around him like he carried some kind of disease. "That'll be $18.50, Mrs. Hendricks said curtly. Not meeting his eyes, Samuel paid without comment, but as he was loading his supplies into the wagon, he overheard 2 women talking on the store's front porch. "It's not natural, I tell you," one was saying. "A white man living alone with that Indian girl. People are starting to talk." "Well, what did you expect?" the other replied. "Sam Morrison's been strange ever since his wife died. Now he's got that wild Apache living in his house, doing Lord knows what." Samuel's hands tightened on the flour sack he was lifting, but he forced himself to keep loading supplies. He had expected some gossip, but the viciousness in their voices caught him off guard. The whispers followed him down Main Street. At the bank, where he had done business for 15 years, the clerk treated him with suspicious formality. At the post office, the postmaster handed him his mail without the usual friendly chat about weather and cattle prices. By the time Samuel left town, he felt like an outcast in the community where he had been born and raised. But the gossip was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, Agent Peterson appeared at the ranch again, this time accompanied by a man Samuel didn't recognize. The stranger wore a black suit and carried himself with the rigid posture of someone used to being obeyed. "Morrison," Peterson called out as Samuel walked up from the corral where he had been watching Ayanna work with a nervous gelding. "This is Inspector Williams from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He's here to check on the girl's progress." "Inspector." Williams looked around the ranch with obvious disapproval, his pale eyes fixed on Ayanna, who was standing near the corral with Windrunner beside her. She was wearing a mixture of practical ranch clothes and some pieces of traditional Apache jewelry she had somehow managed to keep hidden during her time at the school. "I see troubling signs already," Williams said coldly. "The subject appears to be reverting to savage customs. Agent Peterson, you assured me this placement would result in proper civilization." "She speaks English now," Samuel said quickly. "She's learned to read and write, and she's developed valuable skills working with livestock." Williams snorted. "Skills that encourage her wild nature from what I've observed. The goal is to eliminate her Indian identity, not celebrate it. And what's this I hear about her speaking Apache?" That language should have been beaten out of her at the school. Samuel felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "She's become a productive member of this ranch. Her work with difficult horses has brought in more money than I've made in years." "That's precisely the problem," Williams replied. "You're treating her like a valued employee instead of a ward in need of correction. The Bureau has received complaints about improper relations between you and this girl." The accusation hit Samuel like a physical blow. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Williams said with a thin smile. "I'm stating facts. An unmarried white man living alone with a young Indian woman. It creates talk, Morrison, and talk creates problems for the Bureau's civilizing mission." Agent Peterson looked uncomfortable. "Perhaps we could arrange a different placement. Somewhere with a proper family structure." Samuel's mind raced. He thought about Ayanna's transformation over the past months, how she had gone from a broken, silent girl to someone who was finding her place in the world. The idea of sending her back to the nightmare of forced assimilation made his stomach turn. "She's happy here," he said. "She's learning and growing. Isn't that what you wanted?" "What we want," Williams said sharply, "is complete integration into white society. This girl should be working as a domestic servant in a Christian household, learning proper feminine skills like cooking and sewing. Instead, you have her running around like a wild savage, speaking heathen languages and practicing barbaric customs." From the corner of his eye, Samuel could see Ayanna listening to every word, her face carefully blank but her hands clenched at her sides. Windrunner stood close beside her, as if sensing her distress. The pressure from the community only got worse after the inspector's visit. Samuel's longtime neighbors, people he had known since childhood, began crossing the street to avoid him. The banker made pointed comments about the importance of maintaining proper moral standards when Samuel came in to make his monthly loan payment. Even the local preacher mentioned the dangers of living in sin during his Sunday sermon. Though he didn't mention Samuel by name, the isolation might have been bearable if it had only affected Samuel. But it soon became clear that the community's disapproval was hurting his business as well. Ranchers who had been bringing their problem horses to the ranch suddenly stopped coming. Orders for livestock were canceled without explanation. Suppliers began demanding payment up front instead of extending the credit they had always offered. The financial pressure was serious. But what worried Samuel more was the effect on Ayanna. She had been making such progress, learning to trust and open up, but now he could see her withdrawing again. She spent less time talking and more time in silence, watching the roads as if expecting enemies to appear at any moment. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a particularly difficult day, Samuel tried to address the situation directly. "You know what people are saying about us?" he said quietly. Ayanna nodded without looking at him. "I know, they think you keep me for bad reasons. I want you to know that's not true. I've never thought of you as anything but ... "I know," she interrupted. "You are a good man. But good man cannot fight whole town." The simple statement carried more wisdom than Samuel wanted to acknowledge. She was right. No matter how innocent their relationship actually was, the appearance of impropriety was enough to destroy both their reputations and his livelihood. "Maybe they're right," he said heavily. "Maybe you would be better off somewhere else." Somewhere? With a proper family. The words felt like poison in his mouth, but he forced himself to say them. Ayana's welfare had to come first, even if it meant losing the best thing that had happened to him in years. For a long time, Ayana didn't respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. "You want to send me away?" The pain in her voice cut through Samuel like a knife. "I want what's best for you. And right now, being here is causing you more harm than good." Ayana stood up abruptly and walked to the edge of the porch, staring out at the corral where Windrunner was grazing in the moonlight. "At school, they tell me I'm nothing. Here, you show me I'm something. Now you want to make me nothing again." Samuel realized with growing horror that she was right. By even suggesting she should leave, he was telling her that the opinions of narrow-minded people mattered more than her happiness and growth. He was letting fear and social pressure override everything they had built together. "I'm sorry," he said. "You're right. This is your home now, and I won't let anyone take that away from you." But even as he made that promise, Samuel could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The community's pressure was only going to get worse, and sooner or later, something would have to give. The spring of 1887 arrived with unusual warmth, and Ayana celebrated her 18th birthday quietly, marking the passage of time in her own way by braiding wildflowers into Windrunner's mane. She had been at the ranch for almost 2 years now, and the frightened, broken girl who had arrived in shackles seemed like someone from another lifetime. Samuel watched her from the porch as she worked with a new horse, a scarred Mustang that had been brought in by a rancher from 3 counties away. Word of her gift had spread despite the local community's disapproval, and people were willing to travel long distances to see if she could help their problem animals. The Mustang had been badly abused, probably by someone who thought fear was the best way to train a horse. His back was marked with whip scars, and he flinched away from any sudden movement. But Ayana moved around him with the same patient grace she had shown Windrunner, speaking in the mixture of Apache and English. That had become her natural language. "Easy, Thundercloud," she murmured, using the name she had given him. "No one will hurt you here." "This is a place where wounded spirits can heal," Samuel smiled at her words. She had learned to speak English fluently over the past year, but she still chose her words carefully, often in ways that carried deeper meaning than most people realized. When she talked about wounded spirits healing, she wasn't just talking about the horses. The peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of approaching riders. Samuel looked up to see a group of men on horseback coming down the ranch road, dust rising behind them like a warning cloud. As they got closer, he recognized Agent Peterson in the lead. Accompanied by Inspector Williams and 2 other men in government uniforms, Ayana heard them too and stopped what she was doing. Thundercloud, sensing her tension, moved closer to her side as if offering protection. She walked slowly toward the house, her hand resting on the Mustang's neck, her dark eyes fixed on the approaching riders. "Morrison!" Peterson called out as the group reined in their horses near the porch. "We're here on official business. By order of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, we're transferring the Apache girl to the Phoenix Industrial School. Gather her belongings." Samuel felt his heart sink. He had been dreading this moment for months, knowing that sooner or later the pressure from the community and the Bureau would force their hand. "On what grounds?" he asked, standing up slowly. Inspector Williams pulled out a thick document. "Failure to achieve proper assimilation. Reports of continued use of heathen language and customs, inappropriate living arrangements. The girl needs proper supervision and education." "She can read and write better than half the people in town," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "She speaks 2 languages fluently, she's developed valuable job skills, and she's earned more money for this ranch than any hired hand I've ever employed." "That's precisely the problem," Williams replied coldly. She's become too independent, too comfortable with her savage nature. The Phoenix School specializes in cases like hers. Complete isolation from corrupting influences, strict discipline, and intensive re-education. Samuel knew about the Phoenix School. It was one of the harshest institutions in the territory, designed to break the strongest wills and eliminate every trace of Indian identity. Students who went there either emerged as empty shells of their former selves or didn't emerge at all. "She's 18 now," Samuel said desperately, "old enough to make her own decisions." Williams laughed harshly. "Indians don't reach legal majority until they're 21, assuming they ever prove capable of civilized behavior. Until then, they remain wards of the federal government." While the men argued, Ayanna had been standing silently beside Thunder. Cloud, her face showing no emotion. But Samuel could see her mind working, calculating distances and possibilities just like she had during those first weeks at the ranch. Then, to everyone's surprise, she stepped forward and spoke. "I am 18 years old," she said clearly. Her English accent much lighter now, but still carrying the musical tones of her native language. "I can read and write in 2 languages. I understand the laws of this territory and this country." Williams looked at her with obvious disdain. "That doesn't change your legal status, girl. You're coming with us whether you want to or not." Ayanna's eyes flashed with something Samuel recognized from her early days at the ranch. But this wasn't the wild desperation of a trapped animal. This was the controlled fire of someone who had found her strength and refused to give it up. "I choose to stay," she said simply. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "You don't have a choice? We have legal authority? Do you?" Ayanna asked, tilting her head slightly. "According to the Territorial Code of 1885, which I have read, any person who can demonstrate literacy, financial independence, and moral character may petition for early emancipation from wardship." "I meet all those requirements?" Samuel stared at her in amazement. When had she learned about territorial law? Then he remembered all those evenings when she had sat quietly in his study while he worked on ranch business, apparently absorbed in her own reading but obviously paying attention to everything around her. William's face had turned red. "That law was never intended for Indians." "The law doesn't specify race," Ayanna replied calmly. "It says any person. I am a person, am I not?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ayanna walked over to Windrunner, who had been standing near the corral gate watching the confrontation with alert ears. With one fluid motion, she swung onto the Mare's back, sitting straight and proud without saddle or bridle. "I have work to do," she announced. "Horses to train, bills to pay, a life to live. If you want to take me, you'll have to catch me first." Without another word, she touched her heels to Windrunner's sides, and they shot forward like an arrow from a bow. The Mare had grown strong and fast over the past 2 years, and Ayanna had become one with her in a way that seemed almost supernatural. They flowed across the ranch land like water, moving too quickly for any pursuit horse to follow. Samuel watched them disappear over a distant hill, his heart swelling with pride and terror in equal measure. She was magnificent, wild, and free, and absolutely unbreakable. But running would only delay the inevitable. The agents were already organizing a pursuit when the sound of returning hoofbeats made everyone look toward the hills. Ayanna and Windrunner appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the blue sky like figures from a legend. They stood there for a long moment, woman and horse perfectly still, before beginning their descent back toward the ranch, but they weren't running anymore. They were walking slowly, deliberately, taking their time. When they reached the yard, Ayanna slid down from Windrunner's back and handed the Mare's lead rope to Samuel. "I could run?" she said to the agents, her voice carrying across the quiet. "Ranch-yard. I could disappear into the mountains where you would never find me. Windrunner knows every trail, every water source, every hidden canyon. We could be free." She paused, looking at each of the government men in turn. "But I choose to stay. Not because I have to, but because I want to. This is my home. These are my people now. Samuel Morrison gave me something more valuable than freedom. He gave me the right to choose my own path. William started to protest, but Ayana held up her hand. I am Ayana of the Apache people, and I am also a citizen of this territory. I speak the language of my ancestors and the language of this land. I know the old ways and the new ways. I am not broken, and I am not tamed. I am exactly who I choose to be. She walked over to stand beside Samuel, Windrunner following at her shoulder like a loyal guardian. If you want to take me to your school, you'll have to arrest me. And if you arrest me, every newspaper in the territory will want to know why. The government is kidnapping a legal adult who has committed no crime. Samuel saw the agents exchange uncertain glances. The legal questions Ayana had raised were real, and the publicity she threatened would be a nightmare for the Bureau. More importantly, she was no longer the helpless, broken girl they had expected to collect. She was a strong, articulate young woman who clearly understood her rights and wasn't afraid to defend them. After a long, tense silence, Peterson finally spoke. This isn't over. We'll be back with proper legal documentation. You do that, Samuel said, finding his voice at last. And when you come back, you'll find us right here, living our lives and hurting nobody. As the agents rode away, defeated and frustrated, Samuel looked at Ayana with new understanding. She had never been tamed, never been broken. She had simply learned to choose her battles, and today she had chosen to fight for the right to determine her own destiny, standing in the yard of the ranch that had become her home. With Windrunner beside her and the man who had become her family at her side, Ayana had finally found what she had been searching for all along. Not just freedom from captivity, but the freedom to choose who she wanted to be